Well, hello and welcome to the ADA Shop Talk podcast. I'm your host, Paul Klein. And if you are an ADA coordinator, government official, architect, or accessibility specialist trying to better understand the ADA, then you are in the right place, my friend. The ADA Shop Talk is brought to you by BlueDag. Check out BlueDag's Transition Plan Builder and Inspection Suite over at bluedag.com. And got a solo episode for you today, pre-recording this. This will come out while I'm up at the ADA Symposium. So hopefully I saw you there, or we'll see you there, or all the above. So always a good session at those National ADA Symposiums. I went to the first one in my very first one, I think was like 2014 or 15, something like that. And met Jim Terry for the first time, I think it was, in person, and anyway, always great sessions there. So anyway, check that out. We'll have a booth there too if you want to check out BlueDag, and we'll be demoing the new Title II transition plan stuff. So we've been a lot of enhancements there that we're excited about. So excited to have the team demoing that and having it all ready to go for you. So, but anyway, today we're going to talk about parking made easy and accessible parking explained. So I know a lot of you, especially you more ADA coordinators or, officials that don't necessarily deal with the codes on a daily basis, for a CASP and a former CBO, someone who's been doing this a long time, sometimes these easy things that seem easy to me are really complex to other people. And so we've had a lot of guests and conceptual conversations and all those kinds of things. So I thought I'd do a little bit more of a technical breakdown. And in this format, it's kind of different because you can't answer questions. So you can't ask questions. Like in a webinar, you can ask questions, which is always good because, if I'm talking about something and gloss over something, someone will, wait a minute, what did you mean by that? So in this format, it'll be a little bit different, but that's okay. What I want to do is I want to walk you through, parking, and this will be for basically a public accommodation. So, and it really also, the concept of it also really applies even to new parking or accessible parking at a new government building. So it could be a Title II building. I mean, it comes from the basis of my analysis here will be both from the ADAS. So whether you're Title II, government, state and local government, or a public accommodation, it both points to the same code sections and scoping and technical provisions in the 2010 ADAS. So that's what we'll primarily be focusing on, the current 2010 ADAS and some of those requirements, and kind of just walk you through that, especially if you're new to this, or kind of how to tie all this together and how it flows. I'll walk you through this. You can go back and listen to it and everything, and hopefully by the time we get to the end of this podcast, it'll be much easier for you and make more sense and so forth. So, and accessible parking really does seem easy on the surface, but there are some key concepts you have to understand, and I think it'll make sense when I start to walk you through this. But, you think, 8 foot wide, 8 foot access while, 2% cross slopes, got to be on an accessible route. Those are all definitely pertinent, but that's way down on the list. That's like down on number 4 on my list before we even get there. And so, for those of us who do this all the time, we can go right to the crux of the issue because we do it all the time. But for those of you that may be, again, new or don't do this all the time, and you're posed with having to solve the accessible parking equation or answer for your city council or board of supervisors, or you're an architect or whatever it is in your profession, and you're trying to solve this equation, this should really help you. But number one, before we even get into the code, is I like to point this out. I do business training, just did one out in Huntington Beach for Jasmine and her staff out there in the West Coast, Southern West Coast, down in Huntington Beach, California. Hello to all of you listening. And one of the things we did in the business section, we did a little workshop for local businesses. It's always really fun to do that. And one of the things that we preach in those, when we do those sessions, is if you don't get anything else right, you don't take anything from this 2-hour session, is get your parking lot right. And my business partner, Mark Wood, came up with that. And we have a big red slide that we show. And it's like, if you don't get anything else, you don't take anything else from all of these slides and everything, just take this, get your parking right. And the reason why, and I've referenced this before on the podcast, is that you you look at the number of lawsuits, especially in California. I think it was a 2018 study that looked at all of the lawsuits. That it was Title III primarily, but I'm sure it's replicative of the overall sentiment of lawsuits, probably nationwide, and whether it's government or not, probably lines up with this. But basically, it pointed out that looking at all the lawsuits, that almost 48% of all the lawsuits started in the parking lot. And so what that means by default is if you get your parking lot right, you've essentially reduced your exposure to lawsuits by almost 50%. It's just a reverse analogy, but it's so true. And more importantly, and you disabled advocates that are listening out there will understand this. I mean, if you can't park and get into the building, who cares how much accessibility you have in restrooms and boardrooms or hotel rooms or theaters and everything? If you can't get out of the car and get into the facility, who cares? And so it all starts with parking primarily. I mean, most people, that have a car or a van, and Steve Twist talked about that, a former guest on here, and Chris down in South Carolina, how important their vehicle are, and so they can park and go buy coffee and pay for their driver's license, pay taxes, go to court or whatever it is, just like all of us, but they need that parking stall. So that's number one. And that's why, when it's part of making this, part of making accessible parking easy is understanding that you got to get that right. I mean, if you don't do anything else, get that right. And the other piece of that is, what's his name? Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes did that special on Google lawsuits, where they don't even go to the facility. They just look at Street View and they see you got a built-up curb ramp in your access aisle, and boom, they send you a letter and try to get a settlement, especially in the California, Florida, New York states. That's the case. So that's number one, is you always want to get your parking lot right, not just for lawsuits and reduction of those elements, but it provides the greatest degree of access to the greatest number of people with the greatest number of disabilities, because we can park just like everybody else and get into the facility and then determine whether or not other elements are accessible or not. But at least we can park and get in and talk to somebody. So that's number one. And then number two is, again, don't go right to scoping. Right to technical. Remember, in the 2010 building code, 2010 ADAS, it's not a building code, it's a standard. You always start in scoping, and that's chapter 2. And so specifically, you might think, oh, Paul's going to go right to 208, which is parking spaces. But no, that's not where we want to go. Where we actually want to go is into application 201.1. And if we go into 20.11, that's the beginning of the ADA chapter, scoping chapter. And it talks about scope, all newly designed, newly constructed buildings, facilities, and altered portions shall comply with these requirements. And so you got to start there, especially if you're new and you haven't done this before. You need to read through this and understand. I can automatically filter that out quickly on the fly when I get a question. Someone will say, hey, I had a building built in 1962. We're adding new parking in 2024. Boom. I've already filtered out this process. But for new code users and someone who doesn't do this all the time, you want to make sure you're in at the beginning right here. So right through you read scope 201.1, and then it talks out temporary structures, existing buildings. So there's a difference between existing versus new. And there's some allowances and exceptions in here in 202.2 for additions. Talks about each addition to an existing building shall comply with requirements for new construction. Each addition that affects or could affect the usability of access containing a primary function shall comply with 202.4. So there's a code path here for additions, alterations, and then there's 1, 2, 3 exceptions. And I'm not going to go through each of those, but it talks about the primary function. It talks about, whether it's technically and feasibility. If you're dealing with residential, so it could be public housing or transient lodging, could come into play there. So those are all, we haven't even gotten to 208 yet, or for that matter, 501 and 503, where all the how you do it stuff. We're still right in the middle, right in the beginning, and making sure we understand the specific scope before we even get to parking yet. So that's 202. So we started in 201, application, beginning of scoping. We went into 202, which is existing buildings, temporary structures, application based on facility type. And we reviewed this exceptions. Then going on into 202.3.1 is prohibited reduction of access. This is in alterations that decrease or has the effect of decreasing the accessibility of a building or facility below the requirements for new construction at the time of alteration is prohibited. That's a big concept right there that's really important, meaning that once you've established a level of access, let's say you provided parking and you were only required to have 2 stalls, but you put in 3, and now you're doing an alteration and you want to go down to 1. You can't do that because you have to go with what the actual code required at the time of the alteration. So if the original alteration was in the 91, it would be the 91 standards. That would have been 2. And let's say under the 2010 ADS, the alteration would have required 2. You may be able to go down to 2, but not 1. Even though you had 3. Now in California and some states where they have more restrictive, you can't even go below the 3. But the general rule of thumb is whether you're a code official, CAS, architect, ADA coordinator, whatever it is, once you've established a level of access, you want to be really careful about reducing it because a lot of times, especially code officials and contractors and, built environment folks will be just like minimum code, whatever, but that's not always the best case or best practice, because if there's been a level of access provided that helps people with disabilities, you got to be careful. And so 202.3.1 really talks about that prohibited reduction in access. And so you want to review that before you get into your specific parking question. Now, 202.3.2 talks about extent of application. And then 202.4 is a big one, alterations affecting the primary functional areas. So if you're not familiar with primary functional area, that's a big concept in the ADA, much different than a lot of state and local codes like California or ANSI and so forth. And so you really want to review this section, and it talks about when you're doing an alteration or an addition in those types of facilities and whether or not it applies to the primary function. So a perfect example is, let's say you had a quick service restaurant and one alteration is to the front lobby and the parking and the path of travel going into the building. Well, that affects the primary function of that facility. It's a restaurant and the lobby is part of the primary function it's a functional area of that particular facility. Whereas let's say you were doing a bank and you were doing a remodel in the back of the house in the employee only area. Okay. That is not the primary functional area so that has a different level of obligation versus if you were doing a, alteration inside of the lobby of the banks, for example. So definitely want to review that 202.4. And then another one that comes up that you may not have thought about is alterations to qualified historical buildings and facilities. So this is in 202.5, and that's another one. If you have a building that's on a state historical registry, then it may qualify for some limited relief, if you will, when you're doing alterations. The fundamental scope or concept behind that is if you have a historical building that and you're trying to make it accessible and it's going to significantly impact the historical significance of that building, then you're allowed some alternate methods to make it accessible. In other words, like famous one that always comes up is an old Victorian building, and you got these nice pillars and stairs going up, and it's a old Victorian house, but it's the rec department for the city, where they sign up for bowling and swimming lessons and all that stuff. Well, you put a ramp in the front of that, it's going to destroy the historical significance of that building. So what the code allows you to do, the standards allows you to, do a lift in the back or a ramp in the back or some other alternate way to get up into the lobby and so forth that doesn't affect the the historical significance. So that's in 202.5. And here we are. We're almost, 10, 15 minutes into this podcast, and we haven't even gotten to parking yet. And you see, so I'm really driving that home because this is a big section that a lot of people overlook, and that is 203. So, and that's titled General Exceptions. And so, again, as a frequent code user like myself, I'm already familiar with those. So when I get a scenario, a question on a webinar or a phone call from a client or a code official or an architect, ADA coordinator, I'm already filtering this process out. So I'm kind of walking you through it slowly, step by step. But in 203 of the 2010 ADAS, 203.1, there's a general section, and there's all these what are called general exceptions. And you won't find these exceptions in the specific technical or even scoping sections further in Chapter 2. So you have to intuitively know you need to review the general exceptions frequently until you become familiar with them, because there's things in there that you won't see or that aren't referenced in other, especially up in Chapter 5 and, technical numbers 3 through 10. So in 3 through 10, you won't see these exceptions referenced. You have to go here first, which is why we started in 201 and we're working our way up to the parking section in 208. So general exceptions has all kinds of stuff in here. It talks about construction sites in 203.2, talks about raised areas for security and life safety, guard towers, fire towers, those kinds of things. That's in 203.3, raised areas. Limited access spaces in 203.4, ladders, catwalks, those kinds of things. Machinery spaces, that's another one. You won't see this in the accessible routes section, or you won't see this in the 3 through 10 section. It's in this general exceptions section in 203.5, where it talks about, that's the old mechanical, or maybe you got a milking barn like for cows and things like that, or some kind of process like at a Amazon plant where they got a big conveyor belt. Those are machinery spaces and so forth. I remember working for Apple or with Apple in the 90s when they had a CD pressing still here in Northern California when I was working as a code official, and we had these huge CD manufacturing machines, and that wasn't this section back then, but it was the same idea. There's an exception for that in 203.5. 203.6 is single occupant structures. Single occupant structures accessed only by passageways below grade or elevator, curb height, not limited to toll booths. Looks like that's like the toll booth kind of exception, like going over a big bridge. 203.7 is detention and correctional facilities. There's some common use exceptions here, holding cells that you want to, if you're dealing with a corrections facility. Obviously, you're not going to see that in the Chapter 2 or the 3 through 10 technical section. So you got to come here to general exceptions. Residential facilities, there's one in 203.8. And then 203.9, employee work areas. This is a big one that comes up a lot that you won't see again in 206, 207, or Chapter 3 through 10. And so you've got to come in here, and we could do a whole podcast on employee work areas. But basically 203.9 talks about spaces and elements within employee work areas shall only be required to comply with 206.28 accessible routes. So it's the whole approach, enter, and exit concept for employee work areas, but the fryers in the kitchen and drafting tables, in the work areas aren't subject to the standards or building code standards because it can be handled under Title I of the ADA. That all falls under this huge general exceptions 203.9. We just kind of intuitively know this as a frequent code listener or code user, but for those of you that are new, you got to walk through this pattern here. So there's an advisory here. Then 203.10 talks about referee and judging and scoring areas. And there's one for water slides, animal containment areas, raised boxing and wrestling rings in 203.13, diving boards and diving platforms in 203.14. So there we are. That's the end of general exceptions, 203.14. So there's 14 different sections and exceptions in there. So you've got to review all that when you're new and you're just starting this. So we haven't got to parking yet. And again, we're almost 20 minutes into this conversation, and you can see how that process comes through. And, once you've done it a few times, it'll be super quick. But now that we've gone through and we know, I don't even have a scenario in my mind, but we'll just, for sake of this conversation, none of those apply to what we're doing for this podcast. So now we're ready to move on. We've reviewed 201.1, the scope, all the way through 203.14 for general exceptions and nothing. And we looked at alterations, primary functional area, additions, all that stuff. This is a brand new parking stalls being put in at your new government center or Title III, public accommodation and so forth. So now, after we've gone through that, now we can go to 208 through 209. That's the actual code section. So let me get to that here. So 208 and 209. So 208 is parking spaces, scoping for parking spaces, and then 209 is passenger loading and bus stops. So we'll start in 208 and talks about parking spaces, and basically says where parking spaces are provided. Parking space shall be provided in accordance with 208. There's an exception here. And then it gets to minimum number. Okay. So remember, in chapter 2, it's what and how many. And then chapters 3 through 10 tells you how to construct it, how to build it. So what and how many. So we have parking spaces. 208.2 says minimum number. Parking spaces shall complying with 502, the technical provisions, shall be provided in accordance with table 208.2, except if you're an outpatient or rehabilitation facility. And so in 208.2, it's under the minimum number is real important to read that, because if you're dealing with hospitals or rehabilitation physical therapy facilities where mobility may be an issue, it basically requires an uptick in the number of stalls, specifically 10% or 20% above and beyond what's required in the standard table. So important section right there in scoping 208.2. And if we look at the table and 208.2 and we'll just say for the sake of this conversation, you've got 50 parking stalls at a, rec center or the government center as an ADA coordinator. You've got a Title III entity, a restaurant or a retail or something like that, and you've got 50 total parking stalls. If we look at table 208.2 and we go down to the 26 to 50 in the column and we go across, it says we need a minimum of 2 accessible parking spaces. So that's how that works. Basically, the table's really, a lot of you are probably already familiar with that. Super basic. It's just like any table. You look up the number of total parking spaces provided, including accessible. So if people always say, well, do I count the standard stalls, the regular stalls, or the accessible? Just count all your stalls. Every single stall, not the access aisle, but the parking stall, whether it's accessible or not, and get your total number, and then go across. If you have 162 parking stalls, you're going to end up with 6 stalls. If you got 350, you're going to end up with 8. If you've got only 2 stalls on your site, you're going to have 1 stall, and it's got to be van and so forth. So that's in 208. That's a big critical piece, is determining the number of parking stalls. So that's real easy to look up in that table. And then the section goes on and gets into hospital. It talks about 10%. And then for rehabilitation for physical therapy, you've got to have 20%. And so that's a whole podcast or webinar in itself, but just look at 208.21 and 208.2 if you've got one of those facilities. This is not for the sake of conversation. And then moving on, you got residential facilities. It starts talking about, it says residential facilities, but what that really means is public housing. It doesn't say public housing, but really that's what it is. It also could be applicable for transient lodging and, in the 2010 ADAS, anything that's related to residential is typically going to be either public housing, transient lodging, or, dorms and college school type housing, private multifamily apartments and those kinds of facilities are covered under the Fair Housing Act. And, that's a separate conversation. But moving on here, you've got, so that whole section 208.23 through 208.33 is all pretty much for public housing, and 11. I keep saying 11B for 2010 ADAS style of housing there. Then you get into 208.24, which is van parking, and for every 6 or fraction of 6 spaces, meaning for every 6 accessible stalls, you got to have one van. So you don't need another van till you hit 7 accessible parking stalls. So that would be, 200 to 300 regular stalls. So you're talking about a pretty large facility before you're going to need 2 van. So anything under 200 parking stalls, most facilities, smaller facilities or light commercial is going to be in that range. You're just going to have one van, even though you might have 4, 5, or 6 accessible stalls. One of them is going to be van. But when you get to that 7th accessible stall, then you're going to have 2 van and so forth. And then when you get to, you're going to need a 3rd van when you get to, would that be 6, and 6 is 12, 31, 18. I think it's 18. Once you get to 18, which, you got to really do the math, you start getting well over 1,000 stalls at that point. So you don't need a lot of van, but just intuitively know you're always going to have one. And then you're going to have a second one at about 200 regular stalls. And then it goes up from there. So that's in 208.24. There's some exceptions in here you want to review. Then it goes into 208.3, another residential facilities section. And that's pretty much it for 208. That's the big scoping section specifically to parking. Remember, we started in 201, went to 203, then we went to 208, and we have reviewed those. And then 209 is for passenger loading and bus stops. So that's where you have like a drop off or a loading zone, like at a hotel or out in front of an airport. Transportation centers have them like for bus stops and things like that. You would be applying 209. But if typically you're not going to have that. So 209 is not going to apply for like a typical, like say you have a rec department or a city council admin building and you're just providing, 2 parking stalls. You're likely not going to have a passenger loading or bus zone in those applications. You may have a bus, loading, a shelter of some sort, but that's typically in the public right of way. But you may have one, and so then you would apply that. I worked with a large jurisdiction in Colorado, and their main huge admin building for the whole county. They had courts, jails, all their services. They had a big passenger drop-off zone, including a parking garage and so forth. So if you have those, you certainly apply them. But 209 doesn't apply to standard accessible parking and so forth. So only apply that if you have loading zones and bus stops and those kinds of things. Now, once we've finished scoping, which we have, now we can get to section 501, which is basically all of the technical requirements for parking. So here we are. We're almost 30 minutes into this conversation, and now we're getting to the section that's going to tell us, how wide the stalls have to be, what the cross slope is. And so you can see how we've walked through this before. Most people make the mistake and they go right to that technical, and they miss, at best, they miss the 208 conversation, or worse, they miss all of the general exceptions in 203 and the basic 201 scoping section. So for those of you that aren't frequent code users, start in 201.1, go through 203, then 208, 209 if it's applicable. Then we get to 501 through 503. So talking about the 2010 ADAS, section 501 is titled, 502 is called parking spaces. And so that's where we get the technical provisions now. Once we've gotten through all of that minutia at the beginning and determined that either it applies or doesn't apply, and we're not a hospital, we're not a passenger loading zone, it's not an alteration to a primary functional area, all that stuff. Now we can actually apply 502. And it talks about vehicle spaces in 502.2. It talks about the vehicle space, the space where you park. It's got to be 96 inches wide minimum, and parking spaces shall be 132 inches wide for a van, unless there's an exception for the access aisle. In other words, it's the universal design concept. So you've seen those where you have a wider parking stall, which is 11 feet wide, and then you can have a 5-foot access aisle. Or you can have a parking stall that's 8 foot wide with an 8-foot access aisle. So the net is the same, the math is the same, but it basically allows a van to deploy their ramp easily. Some of you are in states like California where you got to be 9 feet, or in Florida it's got to be 12 feet. So there's other states that are 9 feet that go, they have they go 1 foot above the 2010 ADS, but the 2010 ADS is 8 feet wide for a standard stall with a 5-foot access aisle, or an 11-foot parking stall with a 5-foot access aisle. So that's in 502.2. 502.3 is the access aisle, and then we get into the width, length. The length is in 502.3.2. A lot of states have amendments. I think Minnesota, New York, California, maybe Oregon, Phoenix. I know there's a few others out there. I don't think Texas, and most of the standard ADAS and even ANSI states pretty much just say what it says here in 502.3.2 for length. Access aisles shall extend the full length of the parking space they serve. So if your parking spaces are 16 feet, then your accessible parking spaces and access aisle are 16 feet. If your standard parking is 20 feet, then your accessible parking, it's equal. It's going to be the same. Now, if you're in a state like California where it's 18 feet deep, and I forget what it is. Some other places I know they have some similar ones. I think it's 16 somewhere else, but you get the point. 502.3.3 is marking. Access miles shall be marked to discourage parking in them. That's usually that cross hatching. Sometimes you'll see no parking and so forth. That all comes in here in 502. Talks about the location of the access aisle not being in the vehicular way. You don't want to go behind cars other than your own. For obvious reasons, you don't want to back over somebody. Floor and ground surfaces shall be firm and stable and not have slopes over 2%. That's right in 502.4. So if you're looking for that cross slope provision for parking and access aisle, that's in 502.4. Vertical clearances have to be 98 inches for parking spaces for vans, 502.5. And identification in 502.6, that's where we get our sign. You got to have the ISA, International Symbol of Accessibility. Signs for van stall where van accessible is required. They have to be 60 inches above the floor. That's all in 502.6. And each one of these has an advisory here. So look at the DOJ advisory. That's not code. That's not, that's not a standard. It's an advisory. And so it helps you understand the code and kind of understand the intent. So you can read through those as well. And then 502.7 talks about the relationship to accessible routes. And that's the end of the technical section in 502. That's the specific 502.1 through 502.7 is where you're going to find all of the how to build the access aisle and the parking stalls. But you can see that was pretty quick compared to all of the scoping that got us there. And that's the piece that most people who aren't frequent code listeners forget. And then lastly, 503 is the last piece here, and that is specific for passenger loading zones. So again, if you're, you can look at figure 503.3. you'll remember what it looks like last time you went to the dry cleaners or a hotel or the airport. It's where a vehicle pulls up and lets the passenger out. Those accessible loading zones have to be on an accessible route, and there's a certain length and cross slope and so forth for accessibility, obviously. And so you would apply 503 where you have a passenger loading zone. If you just have regular parking, you can ignore 503. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So I'm going to recap real quick. I know it was a long conversation we had, but I hope if you're not a frequent code user, or even if you are, that little review has helped you tremendously. So basically, number one, get your parking lot right. Number two, always start in scoping and walk down 201.1 through 203. 203 general exceptions is huge. Make sure you do that, review that. Once you've done that, then you can go to 208, check your table, get your count, apply 209 if you have a passenger loading zone or bus stop. Once you've done that, then you can apply 502, which is where you get your width, cross slopes, markings, signage is all in 502. And then 503 has passenger loading zones if applicable. So, man, that's parking made easy. Almost 35 something minutes here. So who thought parking was easy? It is easy. Hopefully that breaks it down for you. And hey, I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you thought. Shoot me an email over at pklein@bluedag.com, and join me in the free ADA Shop Talk community if you're not already in there at adashoptalk.com. And this month's webinar is Demystifying the Fair Housing Amendments Act Design Guidelines. It's on June 20th, 2024, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Pacific time. Myself and Victor Felix will be teaching that. So we talked a lot about Title II and Title III here this morning or afternoon, depending on when you're listening to it. And so that session, that free webinar, will get into some of that housing, and we can talk more about parking specific to apartments on that if you'd like. But yeah, if you haven't already subscribed to the ADA Shop Talk podcast, please do so on your favorite podcast player, such as iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio. And hey, go out there and rock your ADA efforts. And remember, let's all work together to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Take care next week. Take care until next week. And I hope you enjoyed this session. I enjoyed you listening. Let's talk soon. Have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.